Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today's episodes are Season 3, Episode 8, or Episode 48 overall, No Weenies Allowed, and Squilliam Returns, both of which originally premiered on Nickelodeon on March 15th, 2002, which is also a relatively important day in Nickelodeon history because it's also the date in which, if you've watched The Fairly Odd Parents, it's the date in which Timmy Turner found out what exactly makes Mr. Crocker so nuts. And I think everyone's going to have a lot of fun with that on Twitter tomorrow. Like, it's been 50 years since the incident, but back to SpongeBob and back to its episodes that I'm talking about today. No Weenies Allowed was written by Paul Tibbett, Kent Osborne, and Meriwether Williams. And a little fun fact about the episode, Paul and Kent actually voiced the nerds in Weenie Hut Juniors. So, it's always funny when a writer does that, like, puts themselves in the episode, but as a complete dork or nuisance. It's a bit of self-deprecating humor that I think everyone can enjoy, including them. But I really like this episode. I'm going to be saying that a lot as we watch it, and I offer some little factoids about it. But I wish I had more factoids because the SpongeBob Wiki says that there's pop-up trivia for this episode on the Season 3 DVD box set, but even if I had the box set, I don't think that, it would be available on the Region 4 set because annoying thing about the DVD box sets is that they remove some of the special features when, they're importing it to other regions, which has always been very annoying to me. And I can't really tell you why they do it. Maybe it's for legal reasons, like they could only be shown in America. But I don't know for certain, but, I'm just really happy to be able to watch this episode and talk over it. With it starting out at the beach at Goo Lagoon, you can kind of think of this as a sequel to something like Muscle Bob Buff Pants, which was also about SpongeBob being considered a weakling and trying to prove his naysayers wrong. This was a recurring theme for a while, and I like this little bit when he pops out to the surface as a little live-action sponge. That's nice. But yeah, you can kind of see this as a sequel and a continuation of that aspect to his character that isn't brought up outside of some Sandy and or Karate episodes. But I think that it's a very endearing flaw to have, just being not physically strong. Like, you look alright, but you can't lift teddy bears for the life of you. And I really like the name the Salty Spittoon. Like, it just rolls off the tongue. But, Muscle Bob Buff Pants, it's got its fans. It's got a lot of good jokes, like the angry shark in the commercial. But, you know what? I think that this is the better episode of the two. Not that I'm ever going to consider doing a showdown of it and Muscle Bob, because, aside from the core theme, you can't really see a lot of similarities between them. Like, SpongeBob's arc is completely different. Like, in the previous episode, he was, pretending to be strong, while in this one, he's not fooling anybody, especially not Reg, who is one of my favorite runoff characters, to be completely honest. Like, I just really like how, he's a tough guy, he's no nonsense, but in his own way, he's kind of looking out for SpongeBob as well. Like, Thomas F. Wilson returns to do Reg's voice after doing Flats, and he does a couple other side characters in, like, Season 3 in the movie. And I think he continues to do it later on, but I could be wrong about that. But, he's SpongeBob's opposite, but, he's still looking out for him. He knows that it's way too dangerous of a place for SpongeBob. And I think that that's what can make this episode pretty relatable to some kids who want to, like, get into adult places. Like, it is nice to have, an usher for an R-rated movie that's like, sorry kids, you will not be able to get into this, it's not for you. Or, like, a tough guy bar, or just any place that, maybe a kid wants to see their parents. don't want to get too adult in this, description, but you know what I mean. Kids aren't allowed to do everything in the world, and, SpongeBob can sometimes stand in for them. And, I mean, look at this place. This is a place for really young children that, for some reason, has a robot, you know, what's the word? A robot employee for, you know, serving drinks and identifying weenies. And I have no idea why it's a robot and why they keep it a robot for the entire time, but I guess they figured if they're gonna have this sort of character, they might as well make it funny and memorable. And honestly, the fact that the Weenie Hut Junior's employee is a robot, even though that might be pretty intimidating for its, target demographics, I think it's actually, probably the least remembered part of the episode, because this is just full of amazing little bits. Like, it took us a very long time to make that potato salad. You got sand in the potato salad. Rocket Power reference. I don't watch Rocket Power, but sure, someone got that. And also the guy saying that he ate a bowl of nails without milk, which apparently, like, I know this, but it comes back in the movie. You see one of the guys at the Thug Tug having one of them. And a lot of great, reactions with SpongeBob, like him, well, a drifter variant of him. Like, that was passed around a lot as sort of like a cool guy. He's with the big, like, 50s Elvis haircut. And what I think is probably the thing I know that for the most is that it appears in his bedroom in Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, even though it isn't even him. Like, I haven't played Rehydrated, but I know Scott the Woz was pretty upset with that, continuity snafu. So that's how I know it. And another thing that I really like about this episode that I think goes a little underappreciated is the character designs for all the tough guys going into the Salty Spittoon, and the tough gal, Sandy, obviously gets in. Like, it's not necessarily that they're big and bulky, but I like how they're lit. Like, they've got a little more shadow work on them than usual. And I guess that's just to show they're a little darker and more menacing. But, it works. It makes them stand out from the crowd in a very small way. But there is an instance later on where they've got, like, the big pink spiky guy, and you can tell that was a painting. If not, then it was pretty detailed for, character art. Also, this little fun bit of SpongeBob breaking his fingers, like, that's a pretty messed up visual, but it's not focused on for long. Like, he puts it in ice cream, it's okay. But that's also sometimes, fun to post. And of course, his, speech earlier in the episode where he did something and only cried for 20 minutes. Like, that was passed around even before it became an image macro. So I've said almost everything I can say about this episode and still have like 3 minutes to go. Guess I can just say, I like this ending because it's good. It's good because I like this ending. Patrick funny. I could keep saying that over and over, so I shall. It is kind of interesting that they just shoehorn Patrick into this story. Like, with an episode like Sailor Mouth, where he has to bounce off SpongeBob, they'll introduce him pretty early. But in here, Patrick doesn't really know the full context as to why SpongeBob wants to get into Weenie Hut Juniors. Like, oh, sorry, not Weenie Hut Juniors, or even Super Weenie Hut Juniors, the Salty Spittoon. Like, he doesn't know why, but still wants to help SpongeBob out because he's his friend, but does mess it up at some points. But the weird thing about Patrick, making things harder for SpongeBob is that he only does it for like a few seconds before, doing this weird routine of getting beaten up by someone invisible. As a kid, I always liked to imagine that there was this random invisible character that just popped up and beat him up for no reason. And yeah, I like that theory, but it's more than likely that Patrick, you know, tried to beat himself up, but, just got too wrapped up in it. Like, you see this sort of trope all the time, the fake fight that they have to put on to, prove something or other, in action films or stuff. But I like this sort of deconstruction of it. Like, what if, the person. What if there was no fight? It was just imitation. And you know what else makes this episode so much better is that SpongeBob's only in the Spittoon for like a second, so all of this was for something that he shouldn't have even been a part of. It's a really great episode on so many levels. It's just good comedy. Like, got a good comedic setup and some good comedic payoffs along the way. And it's all in character for SpongeBob, He's a weenie, but we like him for being a weenie. We like all the stuff that he gets into. Also like that Patrick somehow continues on with his charade in the background. Don't know about Bikini Bottom's medical services if, they have regular hospitals and then hospitals for weenies. Like, that just kind of seems a little disingenuous to any and all fish who, could have gotten serious injuries, but you know what? I won't complain too hard because don't want to speak on their behalf. Don't know what I'm talking about right now, this imaginary fish who had to be admitted to Weenie Hut Junior, but it's a good joke to end the episode on. I like this episode a lot. Squilliam Returns was written by Jay Linder, Sam Henderson, and Meriwether Williams again, but one of its storyboard artists was Heather Martinez. I think this is only one of the only SpongeBob episodes that she's fully credited on, but she's also a prolific writer, animator, and director and storyboarder on shows like The Fairly Odd Parents, My Life as a Teenage Robot, and The Replacements. SpongeBob usually goes at a slightly slower pace than those shows, especially a much slower pace than The Fairly Odd Parents, so I think you can kind of see why this episode feels a little faster paced. Like, it's got the same problem to me as Snowball Effect, where it really starts getting going when it's ending. But you know what? I don't have as big of a problem with that in this episode's case, because, the setup is really good too. I actually am really impressed that they wanted to bring Squilliam back so soon. Like, you think if the pre-movie era continued on for another season or two, they would have done a couple more Squilliam episodes. But then he was just put on hiatus until season 6, and then they really pushed him for a while, and then he just disappeared again, but I'll get to that when I get to SpongeCom season 6 and 7. But unfortunately for a while, this was just kind of seen as a follow-up to Band Geeks, which, very tough act to follow. But, this episode holds its own. You don't really need to know Band Geeks to know this episode. Like, get a good idea of it. I think there's a little more Squilliam in this episode than Band Geeks, so there is that. If you really like him, if you really like D. Bradley Baker's excellent impression of Roger Bumpus' Squidward voice, you've got that going for you. And you've also got this great joke about the world's smallest violin. Like, I'm of the generation that knew of Mr. Krabs' smallest violin joke before the actual, what that motion meant. So, that's fun. Something fun I've always liked to think about with this episode is that Squilliam knows exactly what Squidward's on about. He knows that Squidward's lying through the whole thing and is just kind of faking being impressed at the end. because, the message of the story is, you know, lying ain't right. You have to kind of be honest about your life at the age Squidward and Squilliam are. And, it's hammered home by Squidward thinking that to himself before he lies, and then Squilliam, lying about, having a pretty menial job just to make fun of Squidward. I think that's a fun note to end the episode on, as rushed as it is. But, there's some good bits throughout this little start. Of course, Patrick, for some reason, thinking that he's part of the Corps. It is kind of just the start of them making Patrick weird and random and expecting that to be funny, but, I like that. It's kind of unexpected, and he isn't a big part of the episode after this little preparation period. The thing I've always liked about this episode is SpongeBob's fantasy sequences, but before that, I'd also like to bring up a joke that I've always felt was very overlooked. Like Mr. Krabs, a group confirming to Squidward that he served on the SS Gourmet, but not like as a chef, just served as, a deck swabber, a janitor, to put it lightly. And although the SS Diarrhea doesn't seem like, the greatest place to work, it's a funny name, SS Diarrhea. Like, they were just being funny without even thinking about it by this point. Oh, but here we get to my favorite thing about the episode. SpongeBob's inner monologue as he's pretty much inflicting amnesia upon himself just to be able to remember how to become a fancy waiter in less than 20 minutes. Which, oddly specific book, and I really love this design of him being worn out and on the verge of a breakdown. And this little visual gag of his shoulders lowering and then lowering, and then his face falls off with a squeak sound effect gets me every time. But then you've got the little SpongeBobs in his brain, erasing everything. I actually did read an article a couple years ago from a viewer who expressed serious, acclaim for the joke about, the SpongeBob saying that it's a visual metaphor by calling SpongeBob this postmodern masterpiece of comedy. And I feel like the article was a little overblown, but it is a great joke, and I do like this sort of sense of humor they had about comedy conventions at this time. Like, they weren't afraid to turn them on their heads and, question, wait, why are we like this? And, poking fun at them. And then the SpongeBob says, he has kids anyway. This SpongeBob has canonically, either done it or at least adopted, which... great foreshadowing for tomorrow's episode. Well, not tomorrow's, in 2 weeks. But when SpongeBob becomes the fancy waiter, that's also pretty fun. So we're a little over halfway through the episode now, and we've still got a couple seconds to go until we get the big Krusty Krab refurbishment that SpongeBob does. And it makes me think I would have liked to see more of, the Krusty Krab when it's like this, with this fancy wallpaper, this sort of divine, high-class feel. Like, how did those, music players come in? I said music players, not musicians. Gosh. Is this what you like about SpongeComs whenever I, get flustered and forget words? Because I'm talking for 25 minutes straight every couple weeks. That's also a nice visual gag there. And I like how even though SpongeBob has, erased his entire personality to be a waiter, how he still is SpongeBob. He's doing this very cartoony stuff and is being very quirky about it, which tells me that it isn't about, what he's done. It's just a part of who he is. And of course, when it all falls apart in the end, that is, SpongeBob being SpongeBob. And I think that it's also the first time that Squidward loses against Squilliam, because, of course, Squidward wins in Band Geeks, but some people, while Squilliam was in his little renaissance period, was, constantly beating Squidward. Band Geeks was seen as one of the diamonds in the rough in terms of their rivalry. Like, I think only this and House Fancy are the ones where Band Geeks and House Fancy are the only ones where Squidward even emerges slightly victorious. Even though his house gets ruined in House Fancy, it explodes. I also personally like to speculate. I don't like speculating, but I do like to speculate that the stipulation that SpongeBob could only remember fine dining and breathing was sort of forced onto them by Nickelodeon. Like, you can't have the character choose not to breathe. Like, that would, be a little too, extreme of a comedy idea for kids. I also like this SpongeBob at a computer. That's what computers looked like back in the day. Just these big grey blobs of, black screens and keyboards. Now they're very thin and sleek, but in SpongeBob's head at least, I think that they're still sticking to the old 80s and 90s white boxes for computers. And I find that pretty charming, that this was made at a time when those were still standard. Like, overall, SpongeBob is relatively timeless in terms of technology, but you have little retro bits like that are still kind of charming. Oh, and of course the appetizer. How does Mr. Krabs make the appetizer? Like, how does it have a human foot? How is it like this weird mosquito feces when he was cooking it, but then it grew into this, like, actual slime monster? And this is, like, the part of the episode that I like, even though, SpongeBob's breakdown and the journey to this moment is a bit quick for me. I feel like they could have spent more time building up to it. I do like how this cements Squilliam's personality as a very sore winner of these, tiffs. How when, he wins against Squidward, he will be very, snarky about it. He'll make up this sob story just to make fun of Squidward. You know what I've never liked about that shot of Mr. Krabs with the smallest violin that is nowhere near as small? It's Scott Plankton syndrome. He's got completely white eyes instead of the lime green eyes that he usually has. And, like, they're going to be lime green again in a sec, but I had to edit them for the thing, so a bit of a damper on the ending, but you know what? I like more about this episode than I don't, and also, why is that a bright skybox rather than a dark one for the evening? Timeline's kind of weird in this episode, but that was No Weenies Allowed at Squilliam Returns. My question of the week for you last week was, what is your favorite SpongeBob rage moment? And you guys had so many great answers. First from Jack McGinn when he smashed Squidward's alarm clocks. That was great. I brought up Employee of the Month. Riceform 2001's is yelling at Mr. Krabs and Arg. Dashell Roses is being mad at him in the SpongeBob movie. Whenever he yells at Mr. Krabs, it is kind of gold. I agree with you guys. Rebel Friend says, we're not talking about this or this. We're talking about this. From Krusty Love. Love that one too. And Super Seal says, abrasive side. Just abrasive side. Love how by that point, Mr. Krabs would just be upset by hearing someone say overtime. My question of the week for you this week is, what's your favorite Krusty Krab refurbishment? Because I don't think this one gets enough credit, but there are some other fun ones over the years. But in 2 weeks, meet up with me for Crabborg and Rockabye Bivalve. They're episodes about robots and babies. How do you want me to, synonymize them this time. Anyway, goodbye for now.